You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. It is May 13th, 2021 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I've been talking in the last few weeks about this idea of preliminary practices in the very Western sense of it. And I thought tonight what I would talk about is a little bit about attachment conditioning. Really, what I'm trying to describe is these experiences that get in the way of a deeper practice, that prevent us from really engaging and seeing these insights that the traditional Buddhist path teaches. One way to describe that, say, would be that you allow yourself to understand what a mind state is, that you recognize what awakened awareness is, and then you begin this process of attempting to stabilize it so that the experience of your mind is always in this enlightened frame. And then as you stabilize it more and more to where you're just in that mind state the whole time, you might say that you were enlightened. One of the things that is early on in this process of insight is to see into the experience of self, how it arises and passes, and is basically a sensing experience. Excuse me about the cough. Seems that the spring with the pollen and the smog is especially challenging time for me in this body. One of the things about the nature of self is that if you don't have some contrast or some way of seeing it, some way of distinguishing it from the rest of the experiences that arises, you hardly notice it slip in. And because it's created by all of these sort of conditioned structures, it's easy to miss which is the activity of self, which is a distortion, and what isn't. And so some practices that would allow you to bypass the limiting filter of self so that you could create contrast with it can be useful in deconstructing this. I think that's a popular term. One of the things that we teach in association with attachment repair is the ideal parent figure protocol. And this is a series really of guided meditations where you in some sense bypass the conditioned self response and see through that into the database itself, the pattern of conditioning that's there. And then in seeing the patterning of conditioning, you can distinguish the self between just the beingness of you. We get into the conditioning starts so early, really, before there's the sense of autobiographical memory. The conditioning starts. And it creates these views, or you might say these expectations of what you're capable of, and also what the world is likely to give to you. And if you don't see these views arising in each moment as you formulate self and world, you can create this very limiting experience of the possibilities that are in front of you without even recognizing that that's what you're doing. So using, as a quantum metaphor, in each moment, what opens up in front of you is all of the possibilities that you could choose, a vast array of possibilities that you could choose. And then as soon as you choose one, everything except for the one you chose falls away, and that's the forward momentum, which then puts you into the next moment. and which opens all of the possibilities that are linked to the choice that you made just before. But if these views get in the way of that and restrict what you can see, you don't see the full range of possibilities. You see the habitual choices that you make. Samsara is a word that would describe that, these ruts in your psyche that inform what the possibilities are. If you don't think that you can get some of the things that you want, then you may not even see the potential for having them in front of you. Upajnana is the database where all of these sensing responses are stored. Christian?
Do you think of the attachment work? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Do you think of the attachment work and maybe even the metta as sort of building up or reifying a more positive sense of self so that you're actually sort of getting further away from the no self?
Well, I probably wouldn't frame it like that. It also depends on the kind of practice that you do. In Theravada practice, where we're really trying to see into the experience of no self and have the capacity to shut down the experience of self, there can be a sense of preference for the no self experience. I was speaking to a monk who I work with, who's in Thailand, and one of the issues that he has in the monastic experience is that so much of the interactions that he has are with other people who have great capacity for no self states, but it feels very cold and impersonal. I know with my teacher Shinzen, when he often will do the interviews on retreats in the place of no self, which you can recognize by the way that he looks at you, and 10 minutes later he won't have remembered what happened because there was no self to participate in the making of autobiographical memory. We don't escape the human condition. We don't escape the evolutionary conditioning that makes us want to exist in complex social groups. When you disconnect from that with this idea that complete selflessness is the ideal, I think that it truncates the experience of being human. And that actually what we want to do is move effortlessly between a brilliant manifestation of the sense of self that's fully engaged and expressive, and then slip into the no self when that brilliant expression isn't needed, that back and forth. In the Tibetan practices that I do, the idea is really simply to expand outward and center your experience in awareness itself. And so what you see then is these arisings and passings of the experience of self in this vast expanse of all arising and passing. And it's easy to see in that regard that they're just like everything else, the experience of self, that there's nothing intrinsically personal about it. But at the same time, you have the experience of self in that vast expanse. But you do have to get quite a long way down the road of your practice in order to be able to begin to have those insights. And what do you have to do in order to remove the obstacles that would cause you not to be able to see those experiences, particularly with self, when most of us are so habituated in fixating a solid sense of self that's in charge of everything. How do you create enough contrast that you can see through that and see the self arise and pass as just another non-dual sensing experience? when you allow the mind simply to do what it does, that's one of the ways to begin to understand this. If you make an intention not to do anything, what happens with the activity of body-mind? It continues whether you want it to continue or not, right? It doesn't need your permission. You don't need to cause it to happen. It's just a doing that's constantly unfolding. And really, when you think about it, we know so little about what the body-mind is doing most of the time. There's some neuroscientists who say that the body-mind can process 11 million bits of information per second, but that the conscious mind is only 16 bits. So if you were to use the math there, almost all of experience you're not privy to. Your sense of self doesn't get the memos. When they analyze that, 10 million bits per second is visual processing of the external sight space. So we're massively weighted toward that experience of seeing the world out there. And the East and the West have understood this experience quite differently. I say this quite a lot because it's interesting to me. All the way back to Aristotle, we are inculcated in this idea that we take in what's out there and create a representation of it internally, and that it's pretty accurate. We see clearly what's happening out there, and we create a representation of it internally that we use to navigate the world. Is that how you see the world? Epicurus added this dimension that if you were in a strong emotional state, that might affect the way that you create the working model, but it's still largely coming from the outside inside, where we create the model based on what's actually out there. Later, Plato added this idea that we look at things that are interesting and pleasing to us, and we look away from things that aren't interesting to us. And so we can create a skewed perception of things by the preferences that we have. But still, it's what's coming from the outside in. Whereas in Buddhist thought, it's really that you have the capacity to sense. So you have eye consciousness, which is sensitive to the objects of light, and that you take those in. And then there's an internal process which understands what those light registrations might be. So with eye consciousness, you see light and form, and with eye mind consciousness, you see a chair or a lamp, or there's a piggy bank on the shelf. So I'm looking at that, and there it is. And we understand that mind can have a great impact on what we make, and the database that we use to compare the raw sensing material has a great influence on what we make that sensing experience into, and that our mind state or our view has a great impact on that. And so really, in the Buddhist sense, is we take in the raw data, we process it, and then we project outward the visual experience of what's there. And it could be, wildly inaccurate, rather than that dependence on the idea that we just taken a pretty straightforward interpretation of what's there. Is that making sense? So in this process of practicing, we're trying to sensitize ourselves to this process as it unfolds, knowing that early insight that the self is not substantial and is not in charge, that this whole process of body-mind runs and does all of this, whether the self is thinking it's in charge or not, or even if there's an awareness of the self being there. That making sense. Without the experience of self, really, there's no autobiographical memory made, so you don't remember it. have you ever been in an experience of really high concentration and then looked up at the clock and a couple of hours had gone by? But you don't have much memory of the hours that went by. You have a sense of, sort of a general sense of the activity that you were engaged in, but not the process of time. Is that making sense? So time is also a relative experience in that way. How do you explore the database? When the representations that you make, particularly if you're monitoring them, need to comply with the general sense of how you view yourself and the general sense of viewing the world. And so it's important to then identify a practice that you could use that would bypass those limitations, and that you would have the possibility of seeing clearly the way that the mind is conditioned without the sense of self interfering with that and distorting it so that it protects that sense of belief in a solid, ongoing, continuous experience of self. Is that making sense? You're following me on this one? How do you look at the entries in the database? Just as entries, not in the solidness that they tend to appear as they unfold. And then how do you recognize the limitations of imagination that may have been imposed on you by conditioning? One of the things that we know in doing the attachment work is that young children who long for something in their lives that they're unable to get or are punished for wanting begin to limit their capacity to even imagine. It's too painful to imagine something over and over again that you're unable to get, that you long for and cannot find a way to get that longing satisfied and settled. And so you simply stop longing by limiting the capacity of the imagination to imagine the situation that you long for. How do you know from the absence of those experiences arising consciously where those limitations are? And so using these pointed guided explorations of those experiences is the way that we are able to discover that. And so with the ideal parent figure protocol, we begin to imagine ideal situations, ideal scenarios that are just exactly the way that we want them, with no limits or variations of that. And what that begins to do is reveal the limitations in imagination that we might have, since we point in the direction of something ideal. If you can't imagine it, why can't you imagine it? And if we push at it and it opens up, and you can see that once the limitation of the imagination is removed, that the imagination inflates and can imagine those things, then you begin to have this sensitization to how conditioning actually limits experience in a way that you couldn't see if the limit simply remained. So imagination is one piece, and then there is the actual experiences that you had and the understanding of the experiences. Sometimes we view the experiences in a context that's acceptable to the family system that we grew up in, even though if you compared them to other family systems, the normalcy of them would not hold. So in some sense, this is a process of talking about those things that happened in the context in which they happened, and how the narrative of the family system characterized them, and then taking them outside of that system and comparing them to a broader array of experiences and seeing whether the interpretation that you made was a fairly reasonable interpretation or it was quite distorted by the family system. Is that making sense? I don't have good stories of childhood, and so I can't draw on those kinds of examples, but I remember once feeling a very tender a tender regard for my mother because I had badly burned my hand on some mashed potatoes, and that she ran my fingers under cold water to make me feel better. That sounds like a nice thing, right? What I leave out of that is that she was the one who put the mashed potatoes on my hand. So in the context of my mind and the way that I framed it, it was one of the more tender memories of my mother because I just left that part out. But when I early on told the story as one of these moments with my mother that had a tender sense to it, everybody was horrified that she had burned me and then attended to the burn. But it never registered in the family. That never registered for me because of the way that my family system operated. Now, I admit that my family was extreme, but I'm trying to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Is that getting through? Is that making sense? If you nod your head, then I'll feel more confident. So we talk about in meditation being able to see things clearly and seeing these arisings and passings and knowing that the sensing experience is converted into conceptual reality. It's processed. It's processed through this database, and the entries in the database attached to the unfixated, unattached sensing experience and become something. But we want to really see into the nature of how this happens and really understand that sort of normalcy that we get used to, where something just is interpreted and in front of us, is conditioned, deeply conditioned, and that we want to have some way of contextualizing that without simply coming out of it and dropping into the no self experience. One of the things that was an ongoing discussion with me and Shinzen for probably 10 years or so, maybe longer, was that he used to say, you don't need to do any of this work that I'm describing. You just need to get enlightened. And as soon as you're enlightened, then all of this stuff will resolve. And after about 15 years, when these very senior teachers who you could see very clearly had very deep realization, but were still engaged in harming practices with their students. It's usually some kind of power imposition or sexual impropriety or sometimes physical harm. Over and over again, people who are highly realized, seeming to be caught up in these cycles, that he began to express that it may be necessary to do this work to get into that conditioning and resolve it before you get into a position of a deep realization and the capacity simply not to have to deal with it. I think in the West that most people come into practice because in some way they're suffering. It's not so mainstream yet that everybody just comes in because it's a great thing to do. And maybe more so in the mindfulness world, where it's a stress reduction or something that concentration practices make you feel blissful or happy. But the people that come into the deeper practice are usually coming because they're suffering, and other things that they've tried to do to help relieve that suffering have not worked. I really like the attachment lens because you can describe these experiences, these tendencies to react in patterns. You can recognize the pattern, but not necessarily understand what the pattern is representing. And then listen to the description of an attachment pattern and recognize that this is the thing that's happening. I was listening to a recording. This is back when we had CD players in the car and you could put a CD in. Somebody knocked off a copy of a lecture by Alan Shore, and I dropped it into the CD player and driving along. And he was describing disorganized attachment and how that pattern tended to work out in people's lives. And literally in 10 minutes, he described the entire history of my life in a way that was so accurate and so revealing, in a way that 20 years of psychotherapy did not get at. That was really fascinating. And this was long enough ago that there wasn't really much that you could do about it. And nobody really had an understanding of how to work with it. But thankfully, over the last 20 years or so, that's changed. And there are things that you can do with this. But what I notice in doing it is that it's such a wonderful preliminary practice, a way of resolving these deep conflicts and making everything so much easier that it opens up the space then for you to pursue deep practice. No longer needing to be so fearful about what might come up in practice. This was a perennial problem in the early experience of meditating, is that you sit a Vipassana retreat, or you get instruction through Vipassana, and it turns your attention into the experience of your inner life, and then you stumble across some material that you just assiduously keep out of consciousness, and then you're overwhelmed by the experience, and there's no way to manage it often. Particularly in the beginning, when your meditation skill isn't great, and so then you back out. It's the only way that you have to regulate it, is to remove yourself, and you stop meditating, and then the suffering that originally drove you to meditate in the first place gets intense enough again that you begin to try to practice again, and then you hit another one of these landmines, and it blows up the practice. One of the reasons that I like to teach in the Metta Vipassana framework is because we do the metta side first. So you develop the capacity for positivity, you develop the capacity to concentrate on a very positive state, so that when you get into a difficult state in the Vipassana side of practice, you can retreat into the refuge of the positive loving kindness practice, or compassion, or joyfulness practice, and hang out there, and then let the body-mind settle, and then go back into the Vipassana practice. It's a way of making yourself fearless in your practice, because it doesn't matter how disruptive the Vipassana side of experience is, because you have a place to go to that you can then contain yourself in a positive state, and not be so dysregulated and discombobulated. I thought tonight what we would do is some ideal parent figure, just a general ideal parent figure. I'm looking at some of you out there, and I know that you have an advanced ideal parent figure practice, or you're beyond the beginning. And so consider just doing the preliminary practice again, so that you touch into those building blocks. When we talk about the ideal parent figures, what we want you to do is imagine an entirely fictitious or made up ideal parent. And what we're trying to get you to do is to touch into what you wanted as an ideal mother figure. Some people's experience of their actual parents is so bad that there isn't a way, right away, to imagine this ideal mother figure. If that is the case for you, and it's too difficult, don't stop doing it, and then imagine an ideal version of yourself that would be perfect to take care of you as the young child. So we begin by imagining ourselves as a young child, and then we let the mind open to this completely free idea of what it is that we wanted as an ideal mother, somebody perfectly attentive, attuned to us. And then we imagine an ideal father figure in the same way. And then we imagine an ideal place for us to grow up in as a child and to thrive. And then we go through a series of these qualities that really form secure attachment. The first one is a felt sense of safety, that we're protected and regarded. The second one is that we can be attuned to. Attunement is where you place your attention on somebody and they place their attention on you, and you each know that you have each other's undivided attention. So much of the difficulty in relationship to your parents, your actual parents, comes from a kind of misattuning process between you. You don't really get their undivided attention, or you don't feel seen by them. You don't feel known by them. So imagining that there's perfect attunement, and then imagining that they're capable of emotionally regulating, exactly the way that you need to be emotionally regulated. One of the things that grows out of misattunement is an inability to be emotionally regulated by your parents, which is very distressing for children. They learn emotional regulation from their caregivers, and if the system for emotional regulation isn't robust and useful, it creates distress from emotional dysregulation. And then the expressed sense of delight. And then the expressed sense of delight means that your parents delighted in the experience of you without you having to do anything, just the way that you were. So imagining yourself as this young child, perfectly innocent, filled with the wonder of discovering new things, the joy of discovery, and then being met with the delight of the caregivers who see you as the center of everything. And then there's the piece around exploration. So you are free to explore, and you're supported and encouraged to explore things that are meaningful, things that are interesting to you. And that's really the basis of secure, functioning relationships, that you're involved with somebody who takes care of you in the way that you want to be taken care of. You take care of them in the way that they want to be taken care of, and each of you supports and encourages the other person to explore the things that have meaning to them, and then are present to share the discoveries that they make. That all making sense so far? So let's go ahead and do some practice then. So any comments or questions about what we just did? Michael?
I was hoping you could elaborate on the experience of delight. That's an area that I've been struggling with in my IPF. And like a short story that maybe is some context. I did like a short heart practices retreat. And when the teacher was describing mudita, he was describing the near enemy, exuberance. And giving an example of that, he was like, has anyone seen this TV show? There's this one character that is exactly what exuberance is. And that was my ideal father. And so I don't quite understand what delight is. Well, yeah, delight, exuberance, like it all confuses me. I don't know what it's supposed to like feel like, I guess.
Do you have the experience of delight in anything?
Yeah. In my mind. Sorry, say that again.
Do you have the experience of delight in anything?
Yes.
Can you describe that?
I guess not in this moment. I'm starting to climb up. One specific, I guess, area that I'm struggling with is a feeling of like unconditionality from my ideal parents, that like I can't really make the distinction between like doing and being. And so the feeling is that like they're delighting in me, but it's because of what I'm doing, how I'm perform, kind of, yeah. And I can't quite make that.
And what do you have to do for them in order to get them to delight in you?
So it's this general feeling that what I'm doing is like good. So it's like I'm being a good person, or I am being very good at a sport or exploring, and it doesn't necessarily mean it to them, but it's this feeling that like they're delighting in me because I'm good at it.
So, but you have the experience of delight, even though it's tied up into performance.
Yes.
So then the idea would be to, each time you notice that you're performing, stop. And then notice that they continue to delight in you. Then do something really bad.
Okay.
Notice they continue to delight in you.
Okay. That's an area to explore. I think, but there's still like a confusion around like, what does it mean to like do versus be in this like child context?
Well, maybe you can visualize the child self not doing anything. Just standing still. And then opening the eyes and seeing the parents there just delighting in the child.
Okay, yeah, both of those are very helpful. I can work with those. Thank you.
The one of the things about this process is that it's largely unconscious. So some people are delightful and some aren't. You may have noticed. But you don't really get to choose that. It's just how the whole body mind system relates to them. And the whole body mind system is picking up a whole range of expressions from the other person that the self just couldn't possibly keep up with and track. And so it's important to pay attention to who that is. Who walks into the room and you just light up with delight in the experience of them being there without them doing anything. And then the key is to pay attention to who you do that for, because that's something to begin to value in a relationship. It's the same with who emotionally regulates you and who doesn't. You know, some people, you spend 20 minutes with them, you feel great. Some people, you feel about the same as when you came in, and some people you feel worse. Some people will just light up with delight in the way that you are without you intending anything. And pay attention to that because it's valuable. It's one of the currencies of secure relationship, and it's also part of the energy with which we explore. You know, part of it is going out and finding the things that are meaningful to you. And part of it is coming back and relating the stories of what you found out and having the people that you relate them to just light up with the delight that you've gone and done that and had that adventure and told them. Maybe so that they don't have to do it, or maybe so they might want to. Someone else? Christian.
I had a really novel IPF. I guess I was testing my parents' delight in me in this one. I was being super bossy and basically like not letting them within like 3 feet of me. And I was like up painting on a hill. And I was like, I'm absolutely not going to. It was weird. It was like I was like, I'm absolutely not going to share my painting with you. You're not going to be able to see this. And then like they were like, okay, that's great. And then I basically told them to like fuck off over there while I painted. And you know, and so they were like sitting on their bench over under, you know, over down the hill and kind of watching me and I guess still being cool with what I was doing and so it was not a emotion I've really had in my IPF very much, although I've expressed frustration, but like a feeling of frustration came up at the very beginning of the IPF, and so that kind of colored the whole thing. So I experienced, yeah, it was fine. It was interesting. Yeah, no.
Good. Someone else? Thank you for coming. What's happening? I have a retreat coming up in June, which is virtual if you want to attend it. It's a Metta-Vipassana retreat, but we will have some attachment focus. In July, I'm starting a series of day-longs for the level 1 meditation and attachment. We'll do 4 day-longs over 2 months. And then in December, we're having a retreat. I don't know whether we'll have it as a in-person retreat or a virtual retreat. It depends how the pandemic unfolds, but we are considering having it as an actual return to a meditation center in the woods for that. So stay tuned. I offer the classes on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. I hope that you'll make a donation to support me and the work that Mettagroup is doing, but if you're not resourced, please feel free to come. The community is happy to support you. I will also say that next Tuesday is the last in the beginner series until the fall. I'm going to take the summer off from doing that so that we're going to conclude the Vipassana practice, and then I'll still be coming on Thursday nights to teach this class, but not continuing with the Tuesday night class. Thank you, and we will see you soon, I hope. Bye.